Welcome back to CivilNet as we follow the funeral procession of Baroness Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for a little bit over a decade. And to help us try to understand the awe, the ceremony, the pomp and circumstance is Her Majesty's Ambassador to Armenia, Jonathan Aves.
Hello.
Ambassador, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
What did the Home Office tell you needs to be done today? What are your official instructions?
Well, you know, Mrs. Thatcher is an interesting character because she's a politician. She's not a member of the royal family. She's not the head of state. She's very much a political figure. And although I think, you know, most opinion polls show most people in Britain think that what she did for Britain was a good thing, there are a lot of people still who disagree with what she did. My bosses in London, I think, took that into account, and it reflects the public mood. So whilst we were instructed to behave in a respectful way and to fly the embassy flag at half-mast, we were also given, we were instructed that it was a personal decision as to whether you wore a black tie or how otherwise you marked the event.
How does the British government explain to itself and to its own citizens why a prime minister is afforded this kind of honor?
Well, you're right. It's, I think, really unique because the only other prime minister, certainly in recent history, who was accorded a similar, although it actually was an even higher level funeral, was Winston Churchill. And he was leader during the war when he was heading a government which included all political parties. So it was a different sort of, he was a different figure. Mrs. Thatcher, as we've just been saying, was someone who divided people very much, as well as brought them together to some extent, depending on your point of view. But she did change Britain, and Britain is a different place than it was when she came to power. And even those people, those political parties which opposed her at the time, have been in agreement that she is somehow different from other prime ministers, and then that she requires a funeral of a different status.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the changes she made without, passing any political judgments. Don't want to put you in that position or me. But please describe to us what Britain was in the 70s and 80s. What is it, as far as daily life went, that was so significantly changed?
Well, in the 1970s, Britain was described as a sick man of Europe.
Why?
Britain had to go to the IMF to get money to bail us out. We were in a very bad state. It's difficult, I think, for me to sort of sum up why we were in that situation, but society and our national life was sort of paralysed by indecision. There were too many vested interests of different kinds. Perhaps the one that most people remember, of course, is the power of the trade unions at the time. And I even remember as a child in 1974 when the miners went on strike and there were power cuts, and we used to sit there at home with candles in the evening because there was no electricity.
Armenians won't believe you're saying this.
Yeah, no, it was true. It really happened.
In the 70s?
In the 70s, that was 1974. And then the situation was continuing. There was an awful conflict going on in Northern Ireland at that time as well, and various other problems. And then just on the eve of Mrs. Thatcher's election victory, and I'm sure one of the reasons why a lot of people voted for her, there was another series of strikes which led to, it goes down in national myth now, and I'm sure it happened, but maybe not as much as people perhaps think it did, but bodies were left unburied because people in graveyards were going on strike even. So it was a situation where people felt there was a sense of crisis.
And she came in and made a whole series of changes. She weakened the trade unions. She also did something that sounds very funny unless you understand housing and urban housing and social housing. She made it possible for people to buy their homes.
Yes.
Please explain that.
Well, I suppose, as I understand it, it's not something analogous happened in some of the former Soviet republics, that public housing was turned over as private property to the people who lived in them. It was a little bit different in Britain in that you did have to pay a certain amount of money for the property that you lived in. So in Britain we have a system whereby we have a system of social housing, as you find in, I think, most countries, Western developed countries. And people were given the opportunity to pay a certain sum of money to gain ownership of that flat or house. And it was usually with a reduction, so they would make a profit if they sold their property immediately. And it was about giving people a stake, I suppose, in society, a sense in which that they would have something to lose as well as something to gain. So I think her phrase was of a property-owning democracy, to create to make sort of transform people's aspirations, perhaps, make them think in a more middle-class way.
She also did a great deal to ease the bureaucratic restrictions that have then made the financial industry grow for good or bad, and of course turned the City of London into the financial center of the world.
That's right. There was the Big Bang, I think it was in 1987, where there was a radical deregulation of the city as a financial market, and as you say, paved the way for this massive expansion of London as a global financial centre, which is in its train also, I think, one of the factors why London itself has become such one of these global cities. Well, yes, as you say, of course, people now perhaps just have a slightly different perspective on the costs and benefits of that reform, but I think it's also true that for 20 years or at least, Britain reaped a pretty good reward, even if perhaps in the longer run it hasn't been sustainable.
And how is she perceived for her role in what came to be the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well,
that's where Iron Lady comes from, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That was a phrase that was originally coined by Krasnaya Zvezda, the Russian military or the Soviet military newspaper, as it was termed at the time. I think, obviously there is this element about Mrs. Thatcher which makes her interesting in that she's not just a British politician. She's one of these figures who's developed a sort of global profile. And I think, particularly it is her role in we're working with Ronald Reagan to, I don't think she necessarily saw it as destroying the Soviet Union. She was working with Gorbachev in many ways. She was one of the people who saw him as a new type of leader in the Soviet Union she could work with to some extent to bring about reforms. I'm sure she was not unhappy when communism collapsed, but I don't think she probably saw it in quite that way when she started. But she certainly felt that it was time for Western countries and the Western system based on free markets and democracy had some essential advantages over the Soviet system, and that if you stood up for those values, and I think again this is why she has this broader appeal, it's about her personality. If you stood up for those values and stated them very clearly and without ambiguity and weren't defensive about them, then those advantages would be victorious.
One of the reasons we're doing this today on CivilNet is because we think it's a great example of how politics isn't black and white. Something that was seen as wonderful and brilliant for the first 5 years that she did it is now later being questioned and so forth. And one of those areas is domestic politics. She was asked what was her greatest contribution, and she said New Labour.
Right.
How did she perceive the opposition, and how did they perceive her?
Well, she saw, herself as leading a crusade against socialism. I think she would have seen that. And, in the early 80s in particular, the Labour Party in Britain was really quite left-wing. And I think you'd have had difficulty distinguishing between the manifesto of the British Communist Party at the time and the manifesto of the British Labour Party. It wanted Britain to withdraw from the EU, to withdraw from NATO.
The British Labour Party wanted to withdraw from
and it wanted a large amount of nationalisation. By creating a new consensus, essentially, based on the idea of markets as being somehow the best way to deliver economic growth and prosperity, which is, I think, probably the basis on which the Labour Party now operates. She did transform and change the basic consensus of British politics.
And we saw the same thing later in the United States with the Conservatives moving much more to the right than moving the left towards the center with them. And it does appear that we're already entering the almost entering the cathedral. You mentioned nationalization, so let me ask privatization, and then we'll sign off and let our viewers follow the church ceremony. She also did a whole bunch of privatizing.
She did, obviously a lot of people are looking back now at how Britain has changed in the UK, so there are plenty of articles and programmes in the media about this. And yes, if you look back and look at how much of the British economy was actually physically owned by the state in the 1970s and early 80s, it is remarkable. Not only, you know, what you might expect, airlines and steel industries and railways, but things like transport, lorry transport, trucks were owned by the state, and oil companies were owned by the state. So the state's reach into the economy was far greater than it was when she left power, and probably far greater than anyone in the mainstream of British politics would now sort of argue for.
You know, it must be the politician's dream for, 20 years after, or nearly 20 years after she left office, to be remembered for her policies and for people to still be talking about them and debating.
Yes, her ideas still are, I suppose, one aspect of it. But for me, I suppose the other thing I think that really does make her a figure which I think has her appeal spread beyond that of people who just support her ideas. It's the image of someone who's a very strong, determined woman, standing up for her beliefs and seeing them through.
Yeah, that's inarguable. Everything else may be, that's certainly inarguable. Thank you, Ambassador Aves.
My pleasure, thank you.
We've been speaking with Ambassador Jonathan Aves, Her Majesty's Ambassador in the that's not good. Her Majesty's Ambassador in Armenia. We're going to continue with coverage of the funeral proceedings of Baroness Margaret Thatcher, whose coffin is just being moved into St. Paul's Cathedral, where the religious ceremony will take place. And in between, we'll hear an interview that Tatul Hagopian did earlier today with Vladimir Movsesyan, who was at the time head of Soviet Armenia and who was the one who received Mrs. Thatcher in Gyumri for the short time that she was there in 1989. And we'll continue our coverage through the afternoon. Thank you again, Ambassador.
Thank you.